the handoff, Dr. Shen, on that for tipping it off. So um, our next paper comes to us from Dr. Sara Sands Francis, who is an instructional associate professor in public administration and associate director of the Elizabeth D. Rockwell Center on Ethics and Leadership at the University of Houston. So, Sarah, the floor is yours. I'm really looking forward to this one as well.
Good morning, everyone. Just getting a little set up. We've had some technical difficulties. Apparently 8 o'clock in the morning is too early for my computer to do anything. Need some coffee. Thank you so much for that really brilliant segue. I appreciate it. And if you had told my high school math teacher that I would be doing any causal studies and knew what that is in my life, he would be very impressed that I came this far. So I will pass on the message to him as well. It's great to be here. I'm presenting this work and taking it back to my dissertation, Democratic Policymaking in Schools, the Influence of Teacher Empowerment on Student Achievement. And so I'll start out with a little Reader's Digest overview of sort of where this is going, since again, it's early and all of our brains are just getting started. So the main research question in this study was, does staffing teachers into teacher leadership positions in schools? And per the prior paper, of course, I'll define this for everyone in a second, but does staffing teachers into teacher leadership positions in schools influence student achievement? And the approach I took was a quantitative case study of the New York City Department of Education's Teacher Career Pathways program, which I actually had the pleasure of working on as their research and data manager for 3 years, including through COVID. So find me at a conference sometime and we can grab a drink and talk about what that was like. The data for this, I had two main predictors: qualified teacher leaders and staffing those teachers into leadership roles. And I'll explain the difference in a second. The program had a pretty unique model that allowed for quite a lot of autonomy and agency for both teachers and principals. And so I'll explain what the difference in these predictors are and how it might help us parse through some of the debates in the field. And then my main outcome was student achievement scores, particularly the mean scale score of the school. So one of my goals here was to think about how could we use publicly available data to advance the research. And so I used publicly available mean scale scores for ELA and math in grades 3 through 8. And my findings were that teachers that were staffed into these leadership roles with positional authority to decide and implement policy in their schools were associated with quantifiable improvement in student achievement results in both ELA and math. And this elevates considerations of both democratic policymaking and teacher empowerment in schools as an avenue for school improvement. So that's where we're going, our little Reader's Digest overview. Everyone in this room, I think, cares, and so I won't go too much into this slide, but suffice to say that, particularly in the US, and my sense is kind of globally on this as well, teacher empowerment since the 1980s via teacher leadership has really gained popularity in policy and programs, but our real challenge has been how to sustain these efforts. And part of what's contributed to that challenge is that, one, it's been hard to kind of define what should teacher leadership look like in the right context that people are working in, and also very hard to connect student achievement results to teacher leadership. So as someone that's in a district, when you're arguing over tight resources every year, it was very challenging to make the case when it was so hard to connect one-to-one teacher leadership to improve student achievement. And this has really come out in the literature, and I absolutely love the meta-analysis. I've cited it frequently that our colleagues just presented on, because it really helps us to parse out some of this struggle. If there are more resources, I would love to see them. The 4 big ones that kind of stick out in my mind that have done a pretty good job recently of trying to connect student achievement and teacher leadership have been most recently Supovitz and Comstock. The challenge here is that the teachers in leadership roles, their teacher leaders have left the classroom. And my goal has been to think about how do we keep teachers in the classroom. And they had pretty mixed results. There's some improvement in math when there were teacher leaders, essentially like coaches who supported the school for 5 years. So there's a time element. Yost et al. Did some very interesting work, again, with teacher leaders who were in coaching roles. So again, they left the classroom and they were working with teachers in middle schools. And after 2 years, they could see that schools with teacher leaders returned better scores in reading and math, but again, very tight parameters on that, and the teachers had left the classroom. Sitkowitz et al. Did a study for AIR here in the US, where teacher leaders were still in the classroom and paid more, but they found no change in math and reading scores. And then finally, we have a study and evaluation that was conducted for Leading Educators, which is a nonprofit in the US that focuses on teacher-led school-based professional learning structures. They did a study of their program in Louisiana and Michigan, and they found effects on math scores in both states and ELA scores in Michigan. So, you know, to summarize it all, it's sort of mixed, and context seems to be important, which again won't surprise anybody here. But as we can see, it's very hard to connect student achievement and teacher leadership. So that's what I've been trying to do. I have this because I want to focus on, in my study, we're looking specifically at hybrid teacher leaders, and that definition comes from Margolis 2012. And these were teachers whose official schedule included both teaching K through 12 students and leading teachers. And then I'm also drawing a bit from his definition of semi-formal teacher leadership, which came more recently in 2020, which is the idea that there's something in between sort of the purely organic, informal teacher leadership, where teachers are ascending to roles on their own volition, but without much structure around them, versus very formal, tightly confined roles. In teacher career pathways, the way it worked was that teacher leaders actually were qualified through the district at the district level into one of 3 positions. And each position had its own set of sort of loose requirements that principals understood to be sort of the responsibilities of the role, but very flexible for school context. And then every role had a commensurate pay to go with it. And so there was a bit of informality in that schools could adjust, and also principals could decide whether or not they wanted to staff their qualified teacher leaders. So there was a bit of implementation on the school side and a bit of formality on the district side with the official contract, the qualification process. And so we had a semi-formal teacher leadership process. So that's how I'm defining them here. A bit more about teacher career pathways. So the program was established in 2013-14, launched that school year in the fall. And it was very interesting. It was actually a partnership between the district and the teachers union, the United Federation of Teachers there. So the contract that teachers who became qualified as teacher leaders, and then when they were staffed into the roles, there's actually an official contract that we had with the district, between the district and with the union. So they were really formalized roles in that sense. All eligible teachers could apply to become a qualified teacher leader, and they went through the process. Principals would make the decision then whether to staff those teacher leaders into the roles and then pay that salary addition. And the district maintained, as I said, those broad roles and responsibilities. There is an exception, and there's a whole other study that I'm working on parsing this out. There were some schools that received funding and implementation support, and so they did have certain requirements to fulfill. I'm not accounting for that in this particular study that's coming down the road. So who was served? There were about, any given year between 1,600 and 1,700 schools in New York City, not including the charter sector schools, which weren't eligible for this program. And the schools that were participating the most in teacher career pathways were serving a higher percentage of students of color, students with disabilities, English language learners, and students qualifying for free and reduced price lunch. So you can kind of see here the evolution over time of the number of schools that had qualified teachers growing, and then the number of schools that were actually staffing those teachers also grew, with not too much slippage over COVID, which was kind of impressive. So the democratic policymaking aspect here, it's a sort of a new, trying to combine a bit of political science, was trying to figure out using a framework to help us understand if we gave teacher leaders more, if we gave teachers more voice over the policymaking process in schools, deciding things like curriculum and instructional goals and hiring and allocation of resources, if we really distributed leadership, could we think of that as actually democratizing how policy was made in schools? And then think about how that interacted with teacher empowerment, given that there's so much literature on teacher empowerment that suggests that really empowering teachers to make those sorts of decisions can have all sorts of positive outcomes for both teaching and learning in schools. And so this comes from Marsh and Hall, and sort of thinking about how a framework for democratic policymaking, we could think about it here as, in terms of who's represented in this distributed leadership model. We were selecting the teachers, so it's still pretty narrow representation, but a bit more than being totally non-representative. But moving up on that y-axis there, you think about it as really getting close to pretty large empowerment, depending on how principals would use these roles. So thinking about, does it make a difference if teachers have more voice and real built into the structure of school, real empowerment? Could that make a difference on student achievement? All right, so I've explained a little bit of this already, but what the different levels allowed me to do, because we had schools that never staffed a teacher leader, that only ever had qualified teacher leaders, and the principal didn't staff them. So I looked at schools where the district had said these teachers have the skills, mindsets, and capacities to be teacher leaders, but the principals never staffed them. So these were my qualified teacher leaders only. And then I looked at schools that had staff teacher leaders. So these were schools that had those qualified teacher leaders, and then they put them into these formalized roles. And I used the New York State Education Department, NYSED, ELA, and math test scores from 2013 to 2019. Obviously, we don't have scores from during COVID. So it was a nice little chunk with that. And I looked at grades 3 through 8 only because high school, New York City uses the Regent scores, and it gets really complicated to try to parse out, students can take some of those in 8th grade. So are we really looking at 8th grade versus high school? So I forego that debate entirely, and I just looked at grades 3 through 8. So a bit of my empirical strategy. So it starts, the base of this is a difference in difference model with two-way fixed effects in school and year. But as many of you who might be deep in this sort of research know, there's been ongoing debates. We probably have a new paper that came out in the time I was speaking and a new estimator that's been released during the time of this webinar. But basically, the traditional difference in difference model, when you have something like a teacher career pathways where schools could be entering the program at any given time, it creates issues where you need to basically mitigate bias from comparing early year adopters to later year adopters. So I started with the traditional model, but then conducted an event study using the staggered time series approach, so the Callaway and Santa Ana estimator, to look at effects of adoption by cohort year and in years relative to treatment. So I looked at each cohort year, 2014, 2015, all the way through 2019, and then also, looked at collectively for, in year 1 of implementation for all schools and year 2 of implementation for all schools. So years relative to treatment. And I applied Callaway and Santa Ana. So what did I find? So the first was that if we looked at schools with only qualified teacher leaders, so these were the schools where there were teachers who who the district said, you are qualified to lead, but the principals did not staff them. I observed no change in ELA and student achievement. And indeed, there's even a decline over time. So there's evidence of this suggested decline where the coefficient goes from 0.06 standard deviations. This is the standard deviation. So to translate this is the average causal effect of the qualified teacher leaders on ELA scores here, which is basically the amount that the mean scale score for schools with qualified teacher leaders would have gone up or gone down. And so the coefficient goes from 0.06 standard deviations in year 1 to like -0.2 in year 4, which would suggest that like really there's not a lot of impact here. And just to make it clear, there were no significant pretreatment effects here. And I observed a really similar trajectory in math. So we can see here, there was no effect when qualified TLs were not staffed. And again, we see that pretty substantial, nearly identical downward trend going from year 1 to year 4 here. In that 0 year, the way the Callaway and Santa Ana estimator works is that you never drop a year in that. So you never like drop the 0 year in that particular estimator, you keep all years. So that's why you see it going through the 0 year for those of you who might be raising some questions on that. Now, what happens, this is the exciting part, what happens when you actually staff those qualified teacher leaders into positions where they have formalized responsibility and positional authority to lead and make decisions in schools, and also have commensurate pay? So in this study, it was pretty exciting. So there was positive, increasing, statistically significant effects when teacher leaders were staffed. And here we can see that the coefficient is going from 0.05 standard deviations in the introductory year to like 0.3 in year 5. So about a 0.3 standard deviation increase in the mean scale score for schools staffing teacher leaders. So the average effect of staff teacher leaders on ELA, this is also really interesting, I thought, and I'd be curious to hear your thoughts as well. What I found interesting here is that it shows compounded continuous improvement. So it appears that over time, schools are improving more quickly, which would suggest to me the way that I've interpreted this is that with a lot of these programs, for those of you who've done this research for a while, we know that there's sort of a conditions of success that are needed, and then also a startup lag. And so we start to see gains early on, but then over time, that really increases. I should also just mention that when I did this, a downside of the program is that schools can kind of come in and out of it. Teacher leaders move schools or budget changes year to year. And so the way I did that was that if the school had ever staffed a teacher leader, I kept them in this sample. So this would also suggest then that even just having 1 year of this sort of distributed leader program in the school could potentially be leading to some overall gains year to year, which is an interesting idea that probably needs more unpacking in another study. Can't wait to hear your thoughts. So math follows a similar trajectory, and we see about the same, a slight dip in that year 3, but otherwise the same positive, increasing, statistically significant effects. I'll say here there was one significant pre-treatment effect, but that was like 3 years before adoption, and it was a negative sign. And so I'm not so concerned about that pre-treatment effect. It's enough. To me, it was further enough away from the treatment year that I wasn't overall worried about it. So what are the implications of this? So the first is that, one, these compounded changes in student achievement for staff teacher leaders indicates that roles with responsibilities, positional authority, commensurate pay might be really critical to the success of teacher leadership initiatives. And also that, investment probably needs to be for a longer term. I know that I said that I just kept it in even if schools only teacher leaders for 1 year, but, imagine if, every school had to keep teacher leaders in for a 5-year duration of a program, what could be the possibility there? So thinking about investing in these formal roles and structures for more time. I'll pay some heed now to the question of, well, should we be concerned about hierarchies? That there's been a concern that formal teacher leadership could lead to the reinstitution of traditional hierarchies and power in schools. And I'd say there's a study that I just published with Jason Margolis and Fiona King, where I looked at the survey data coming out of teacher career pathways, and it doesn't give credence to that. It doesn't suggest that we should be too concerned about the reestablishment of formal hierarchies, and that actually, based on this data, based on the declines in the qualified teacher leader schools only, that maybe the organic roles actually don't have enough of the formality around them to lead to these bigger changes that we see in the staff teacher leadership schools here. There are some limitations to this study. I'm assuming exogenous treatment variation, but that can get a little dicey, particularly since some schools might have been incentivized by funding along the way. So the selection bias here could present a problem. Like all schools research, a lot of programs are implemented in conjunction with others. Teacher career pathways is not different. So we could have a question of concurrent program effects here. And then there's an assumption that all schools kind of implemented the vision of TCP with fidelity, especially in those schools that received funding to do so. That's going to be a little bit harder to parse out. So there are some limitations, but overall, the results look promising to me. And I will stop there so we have time for discussion, but thank you so much. This is very exciting.